I remember going out there and buying my first investment property, and I laugh about it now because the property that I bought, and I thought I was killing it, and I thought I understood everything there ever was to know about the property marketplace. But sort of 10 years down the track, having just bought my 12th property, as well as over $250 million worth of property for my clients, I've learned a thing or two about the key performance indicators. So if you want to take your investing to the next level and really start to understand how the pros analyze a marketplace or analyze a suburb, this is the video for you. G'day there, my name's Ben Everingham and I'm the director here at Pumped On Property. And if you haven't already checked out our website, check out www.pumpedonproperty.com. Now, as I said in today's video, I wanted to talk about the key performance indicators. So by this stage for this video, I assume that you've decided that you want to buy an investment property. You've decided that it's the right time for you to buy an investment property and you're in a financial position to do it, or you're thinking about it in the future, and you've identified which market you want to buy in. So, let's pretend this is Australia. Here's Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, Adelaide, etc. I'm assuming that you've narrowed it down to one marketplace, and if you haven't, take a look at Heron Todd White's report, or take a look at what CoreLogic's saying about the Australian market right now. But for me, the market I'm focusing on personally at the moment as an investor is Brisbane, because CoreLogic's saying it's cheaper to buy in 2019 than it was in 2008. A lot of Australians, or more Australians, are moving here than anywhere else, and it's bloody cheap. It just hasn't grown in value in the same way that Sydney and Melbourne have in recent years. So this is the area that I'm focusing. But Brisbane or Southeast Queensland is about 700 suburbs. So how do you find the right suburb to invest in? And that's what I'm going to talk about now. So there's a couple of rules which I've talked about in previous videos, which I don't have a huge amount of time to go on, but we'll touch on. Now, we want to buy metro markets because CoreLogic's data has showed us that over the last 25 years in Australia, metro markets, meaning the capital cities, have outperformed the average regional area by about 86%. We also want to be buying houses because CoreLogic has also suggested that over the last 25 years, houses have outperformed units by over 96%. Now, Michael Matusik has done some stuff to suggest that buying closer to the city or closer to the beach also has a long-term value premium, meaning it grows in value at a faster rate than further away. So, if you're buying metro, you're buying houses, and you're buying close to the city or the beach, then that's a way that you can reduce some of your risk as a long-term investor. Now, I'm talking 10, 15, 30 years into the future. This isn't the channel where you go get rich quick type thing. So one of the key performance indicators that I look at is the distance to the CBD. Now, as I said, I only invest in major metro markets personally. Sydney and Brisbane have been the two that I've been focusing on, or the major regional markets around it. Sort of 6, 7, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, I was buying, on the Central Coast. I've also been buying in North Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast over the last 5 years as well. So I want to know the distance to the CBD because that is very important. That's where some of the jobs are, and that's where a lot of the higher incomes are. That's where the more expensive properties are. I also want to look at the population. Now, population is very, very, very important. Effectively, areas where there's more people generally have higher incomes, more jobs, more infrastructure, and all of those things equal more long-term value as a market from a property perspective, from my perspective. Now, I don't like the hot spotting stuff. I don't like buying the small towns. Even though some of them might do better than the big cities in the short term, they almost never do long term, and gains in those areas are a lot more lumpy as opposed to sort of consistent over a 20-year period, which is what I'm looking for in a big city. Now, after looking at the population, again, for me, the bigger, the better. I like to look at the average annual growth rate. So average growth rate over the last 10 or 20 years. Now, the reason that's important and why it's important to look at history before you go rushing into a market is that average growth is a big precursor for what might happen in the future. Now, the past doesn't perfectly predict what's going to happen in the future, and we all know that wages aren't rising like they were in the past, or property isn't as cheap as it was in the past. So I don't expect property to keep doubling every 7 to 10 years, but you want to know that you're investing in a market that's got a long-term performance. So that's why I like Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, because according to Homely, in the last 46 years or 48 years, they've all done an average of over 9% per annum. And in the last 20 years, they've all done an average of over 6% per annum. Now, I then look at the average price growth in the last 3 years, as well as the last 12 months. Now, effectively, I want to be timing the market as accurately as I can. There's some great reading from Phil Anderson as well as Fred Harrison if you're looking at timing the big picture. Or like I said, you can check out CoreLogic or Heron Todd White's stuff if you're looking at the Australian market right now. But I just like to get an idea of what's happened in the last 12 months and the last 3 years to make sure I'm not buying somewhere that's already gone up dramatically and I'm missing out on the growth, or I'm buying at the top of that cycle. So, you know, it'd be like buying Sydney or Melbourne, for example, in 2018 or 2017. It was very clear for anyone that had understood the history that the market had gone through a huge growth cycle of between 60 and 80%, and that just was not sustainable. So if you had have looked at the last 3 years, 12 months, 10 years, you would have known that it was at the top, or read that Heron Todd White stuff or CoreLogic stuff, which was calling it well before it actually happened. Now, if you can get access to it, I like to look at the predicted price growth. Now, that's difficult to find, and you've got to pay for that information. Residex, who had just been bought out by CoreLogic, do some good reports on this stuff. John Lindemann also does some reports on this stuff. Michael Matusik does a bit of that stuff. None of them are highly accurate. You know, none of those guys have a crystal ball, but they have been analysts in the market for a long time and have sort of a science that they apply to their art, which is forecasting the future. But, you know, some of the suburbs that I've found in those Residex reports have performed in line with what they said was going to happen. Other suburbs haven't even come close. So again, take it with a grain of salt. It is certainly not it's certainly not a silver bullet or something you should be rushing in and believing absolutely with certainty that it's going to happen. Now, the next thing that I look at obviously is the median or medium house price. There's slight variances there, but effectively what I'm trying to figure out there is what the average property is worth. And then from there, I start looking at the sales history. Now, sales history is so important because effectively what's on realestate.com or Domain or what the agent's telling you means absolutely nothing. What is sold in the past is a true representation of where the market is right now. So it's a very, very important piece of information that I just like to make sure that I'm buying a property that's at least in line with market value, if not below market value. Then I look at the median, now that's the median sale. I also look at the median rent or the median rent, and I basically get an idea of what properties in the suburb are renting for. Now that could be a 1-bedroom home, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom, 5, and all of them have different averages. There's some good free information, like outside of the predicted price growth stuff. None of these things you actually have to buy. You can find it all on local stats, on realestate.com, on Domain, or just by Googling it and finding stuff like real estate investor. So I then like to look at the vacancy rate. Now, I really like suburbs that have a vacancy rate, below 2%. Now, below 2% represents an undersupply. Below 1% is chronically undersupplied. Now, if you look around Australia at the moment, Sydney is oversupplied and is going to be worse in the next few years. Melbourne's a little bit oversupplied in parts, as is Darwin, parts of Canberra, parts of Perth, as is parts of Brisbane. Other markets or suburbs in all of those areas are undersupplied. So you've really got to reduce it down to the local suburb level, but 2% is a really, really nice indicator to keep an eye on. I then look for how many properties were sold in the last 12 months. Now, this just gives me an indicator that I really want to be buying suburbs where there's a good number of sales between 70 and 200 per annum, just so that if I am forced to sell the property, it's a good size market with lots of sales, or if I need to revalue my property, I can compare it against other more expensive properties that have recently sold, and I can justify a higher valuation. Or if at the wrong time of the market cycle someone sells out for a ridiculously cheap price, then there's other comparable sales to say, hey, that's an outlier, that's not the norm in this area. I then look at average days on market. Now, this is important because this is an indicator of supply and demand. And you watch average days on market increase and decrease. Now, 3 years ago in Sydney, the average time on market was under 30 days, which is very hot. That's kind of like an auction clearance rate of around about 80%. Then you can see now in areas of Sydney, you know, the average time on market's 120 days. All of that steam that was in the market has gone, and that means it's a softer market. So when I see an average days on market below 35 days, I know that it's hot. And if it's over 50 days, I know that it's kind of medium, depending on the price point. And if it's over 90 days, you know, you just have a lot more room to negotiate in a marketplace like that. But just because the days on market are really high doesn't mean it's a good market to invest in at that time. You know, all of these things need to be looked at in conjunction rather than just looking at one of them at a time, so that you can make the best possible decision. Because Sydney might have a shocking auction clearance rate and a very high average days on market right now compared to 3 years ago, but it is still 70% more expensive than it was 7 years ago. So you've got to factor these things into account. Now, another indicator of supply and demand, which is really important when making a decision, is the average vendor discount. So that's the, you know, from the time they go up on realestate.com to what they actually sell for, the average in the suburb. Now, the amateur investor, I suppose, and I don't like saying that, but there's a big difference between an amateur and a pro in anything in life. The amateur investor will jump on realestate.com or Domain and think that that is market value. A professional investor will look at the average vendor discount. Now, in some suburbs in Sydney now, the difference between what it is on realestate.com and what it sells for is up to 20%. Now, if you were to jump on realestate.com and go, oh, I think I have an idea about what the market's doing, without looking at the sales history or the average vendor discount, you could overpay for a property 10, 15, 20%. But if you understand this average vendor discount, even if the discount's small, like 3%, that means that you can almost automatically, for the average agent in the average area, especially when you're buying outside of area or in a different state, it's a good number to look at. You know, if the property's online for 500K and the average discount's 5%, you can almost take $25,000 straight off the top before you even negotiate. So it's really powerful. You know, imagine you're looking at a $2 million suburb in Sydney with an average vendor discount of 20% right now. That's a 400K difference. They just put it higher because they know people like to negotiate, or to catch that person every now and then that doesn't know what they're doing. In fact, most of the time, you know, without them doing this number. Now, you can also look at supply and demand on realestate.com. So the way that I do that is you look at how many people are looking in that particular suburb at the average listing versus how many people are looking in the average of that state. Now, it's not a really, really strong indicator, but you can see this change over time as suburbs get hot or cold. You know, the average number of views per listing in Queensland might be 300 per property, but in this specific suburb, it's 800 people are looking at this property. You know, a month, you might go, well, that's almost 100%, or it's more than 100%. On average, maybe I should have a look into that suburb and just see what's going on with all these other numbers to see if, you know, I'm seeing something that maybe hasn't translated into sales values yet. Because the goal of an investor, right, is to buy low and then ride the market out. Unfortunately, most investors buy high and then lose value in the first 5 years in terms of what they buy, because they've either bought rubbish, brand new property from a property spruiker, or they're bought at the top of a market when everyone else is, and then they're sitting in the corner scared when things are going down, which is actually a much better time to be looking at things. So another one is how the locals rate the suburb. There's a website called homely.com that gives a star rating, and people can go on and either bash a suburb if they don't like it for rental or ownership, or love it, and they put in a little rating. Just be aware, like everything in this game, it can be artificially manipulated by an agent that wants to pump up the rating to get it in a hot spotting list. But it can be a nice way, if you're buying somewhere that you're not familiar with, to get a bit of a feel for what tenants and owners are saying. Now then we get to demographics. Now I'm just going to say that's demo. Demographics is a bunch of different things, but some of the things I look at is the average household income. You want it to be as high as possible. Obviously, look at the average age of people living there and what the trends over the next 15 to 20 years will look like. I look at how many people are married, how many people are starting families, mature families, aging, first-timers, singles. I look at the percentage of people renting properties as well. Now, they're the things that I look at on a data sheet. So what I do as an investor is I've got this little data sheet which has all of these things. And let's say that I'm looking at, Vaucluse in Sydney, for example. If you've got a spare $5 million, then that's your one. Maybe, I don't know. And then I look at all of these things and I actually map them out. And then what I do, because I'm a bit OCD with this stuff and because I do it professionally for our clients, is I look at every single suburb in Brisbane across all of these indicators and some more, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then I handpick maybe 3 to 12 suburbs that represent the most value. And then from here, I go to the next level, which is about another 100-point checklist that we use internally to make sure that the suburb we're buying is the right one for all of the right long-term as well as medium-term reasons. I then look at schools, shops, train stations, infrastructure, all of those important things that obviously have an effect on long-term desirability of an area, particularly good school districts and train stations. I look at the major shopping centres and the distance from this suburb. I look at the public transport options and the distance from the suburb, or if they're in the suburb. And then I look at DSR score. Now, I think this is an important one. It effectively looks at 8 of the different things in this model and puts them into an algorithm and then spits out a percentage. Now, a DSR score that I like to buy between is about 55 to 70. It's not the higher the DSR score, the better the suburb as a buyer. So between 55 and 70 is generally when there's some demand, but it hasn't really translated into super meaningful price growth, and I can still buy at a bit of a discount. Once it gets over 70, it's very strong demand, and then people selling properties generally sell them for more, which means the market starts increasing in value. So it's interesting, like some suburbs I've been buying in Brisbane at the moment, I've seen the DSR scores go from 55 to 90, back to 60, back to 85. Like, this is a constant indicator that's changing based on supply and demand, and a really nice way of looking at things if you're just looking for 1 or 2 numbers. The last one that I look at on my list here is the walk score. Now, again, this is a number out of 100. So is the DSR score. Effectively, it's how desirable a suburb is to live in if you don't have a car. So, where's shops, cafes, restaurants, bars, train stations, schools, jobs, and all of those important things that actually matter to people. As cities grow in size, people should be using their cars less as the infrastructure grows. So these are some of the indicators that I look at on a higher level. Once I've identified the market, like Brisbane, I look at every suburb across these indicators and try and narrow it down to, a collection of suburbs, and then from that collection, maybe 1 or 2 suburbs that I'm focusing on to buy for myself or my client to make my life as simple as possible. Now, I know some of that might seem like new information. You can slow this video down, you can go back and re-listen to it, you can map out your own little data sheet. But this is really important information if you're looking to become a better investor. This is the absolute minimum. I won't even consider a suburb. It takes me about 5 to 10 minutes to put that together for one suburb, and then I have a look at all of those suburbs, and each of these things have threshold points. A few of them I've talked about in this video that enable you to make decisions. Now, as an investor, your job is not to buy a property, it's to not buy a suburb or not buy a street or not buy a property or not buy a market. You should be looking for reasons to not buy rather than going, oh, everything looks so interesting, and being that kid in the candy store or that deer in the headlights that is just running towards a goal without the right information to do it. So, hope you've enjoyed this. For those of you who are seriously considering buying a property in the next 12 months, I'd love to have a one-on-one strategy session with you. Please jump over to my website, www.pumkedonproperty.com, and book in a time that works for you so that you and I can sit down and look at where you are right now, where you would like to be in the future. We can discuss all of these things in a lot more detail. We can talk about the positives and negatives of the current market, and we can talk about your property investment goals and, you know, some strategies that may help you get towards where you want to be in the future, which might be owning a property or might be financial freedom through property, and we can have a great chat. Now, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much again. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Check out our podcast, The Pumped on Property Show. And if you like this video, please give us a little thumbs up. Really appreciate your time. Good luck with your investment journey.